All right. Hi, everyone. Um, I'm happy to be here. Thanks to Kelly for making this event happen and for her support. This was, I think, originally supposed to happen last fall, but due to certain circumstances, it's happening now. So I'm just going to get right into my presentation. I'm hoping it will be around 30 minutes, and I'm going to time myself just to make sure that I'm on track. Let me see. Oh, just give me a second. Okay. All right. Okay, so hopefully folks can see the PowerPoint. All right, so this talk is called Forever Foreign Along the Rim, Asian American Experiences. First, let's do a quick check-in. I'm not sure where people are logging in from. I'm logging in from Columbus, Ohio, where I'm currently based, but I'll be moving back to Oakland, California in a few months. But yeah, I'm sure folks are spread out around the US or maybe around the world. So along with your location, if you'd like to, you don't have to disclose your location if you don't want to. Maybe a word or two to describe how you're feeling right now, whether it has to do with the topic that we're going to talk about or just how you're feeling today. So let's see in the chat. Where did the chat go for me? Oh, there it is. Someone says excited, South Korea. Oh, cool. I'll put in my word. Oh. Tired for me. All right. So St. Petersburg, Florida, Jakarta, Beijing, DC. Nice. I moved to Columbus from the DC area last year. And yeah, folks are free to keep typing into the chat box. I don't think I introduced myself. I'll give a brief introduction. I'm Dr. Terry K. Park, he, him pronouns. I used to be an Asian American Studies professor for about 8-9 years at, I can't even remember how many institutions, I think around 7 or 8. Most recently, the University of Maryland College Park, where I was a full-time teaching focused faculty member in the Asian American Studies program. Before that, I taught at Harvard, Wellesley, Miami University of Ohio, Hunter College, San Quentin State Prison, where I taught Asian American theater. And I got my PhD in cultural studies at UC Davis. So that's a very brief introduction. I'll say a little bit about my new consulting company. So I've made the transition from academia to educational consulting, and the name of my consulting company is Maum, which is a Korean word that refers to the mind, body, heart, and soul as connected. So that's the way that I view education and specifically teaching Asian American studies outside of the ivory tower, outside of the classroom, and to a broader public, which is needed now more than ever, of course, right? With this current resurgence of anti-Asian violence. And I offer curriculum assistance, online courses. I'm hoping to launch shortly storytelling curation. So before I made the ill-fated decision to enter academia, I was an actor. That was actually my passion. And I continue to bring my performance skills into my educational services. And then lastly, professional development, like talks like this. And the website will launch in about a month on April 29th. But for now, I'll just drop the link to my LinkedIn into the chat box. And if folks are interested in keeping up to date on Maum, you'll see updates on my LinkedIn. Okay. So I looked at some of the questions that were given to me last fall. And one of the questions really resonated with me, and it's really the launch pad for this presentation. But I'll also touch on some of the other questions that I saw. And then, of course, it sounds like I'll receive some other questions. But this is the question here that I'm really addressing, which is, why do some Asian Americans feel hesitant to provide explanations on their Asian roots to people they meet? For some people living in Asian countries like Indonesia, this is often perceived as if they do not want to be associated with being Asian or feeling ashamed of their Asian features or roots. So, right, this idea that Asian Americans seem to want to be disassociated from their Asian heritage in Asia. Why is that? And that's what I'm going to address with this presentation. And I'm going to thread some historical facts with forays into my family history and some other bits and pieces here and there. So that person is my father, who graduated from Seoul National University. I think he studied political science, but then he decided he wanted to change. He wanted to study something different, and specifically, he wanted to study in the US. So that's him in his dorm room in Utah, at Utah State University, I believe in 1966. And then shortly after, he met my mom. They got married. He sponsored her. They came back to the US, where they started a family. And they lived all throughout Southern California, including Irvine, which is that photo there. That's the backyard of the first house that I lived in. I just lived there for a few months. But that's her surrounded by jars of doenjang, which is fermented soybean paste, which is used in a lot of Korean cooking, as I'm sure some of you know. Back then in the mid-70s, I guess there weren't any Korean grocery stores, no H-Marts. So Korean immigrants like my mom had to make do with what they had and create their own food and exchanged it with other members of the very small Korean community. And so my first name is Terry, my brother's name is Tony, and my sister's name is Tammy. I don't know if that's an Asian American thing. I feel like I've met other Asian Americans who have siblings with the same first letter. What I find kind of both funny and sad and illuminating is that she named me Terry, even though it's difficult for her to pronounce that word. And I think that says a lot, right, about that particular time period of the 1970s, the US, and also the location of Irvine, which is historically a white conservative area. And so I can just imagine how strong the force of assimilation into whiteness, to the point where she gave me a name that she could not pronounce correctly, quote unquote. I actually love the way that my mom pronounces my name. But again, right, it sort of sets up this milieu that I was born into, this assimilation into whiteness. Something that my parents didn't know at the time was that my dad would not have been able to enter the US as an international student if it weren't for the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, or the Immigration Act, that struck down race-based quotas that were a part of previous immigration legislation, and set up a preference system for highly skilled, highly educated Asian immigrants like my father to come from South Korea to the US to pursue his studies, to start a family, and allow me to have the life that I have. And if it weren't for Black civil rights movements that mobilized a lot of energy that led to President Lyndon Johnson signing the 1965 Immigration Act, then again, my dad wouldn't be here, my mom wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be here. I actually just learned a few weeks ago, I was in LA staying with my aunt, that my father sponsored her and her husband and their 2 kids. So family reunification was a huge part of the 1965 Immigration Act. Scholars call it an accident that the crafters of the legislation did not foresee, but that people like my dad and other Asian immigrants used to help bring other family members into the US, which led to a huge population explosion. That's so I actually, even though I was born in Southern California, I grew up mostly in Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah, which, as you can tell from that photo and what you probably know, it's not the most diverse state in the country. It's become a little bit more diverse, but back in the 80s and 90s when I grew up there, I barely saw any Asian faces. I barely saw any non-white faces. It's a, a predominantly white, predominantly Mormon, predominantly conservative area. And so again, kind of keeping with this theme of assimilation, or friends, or even my own family members. I grew up with a lot of internalized hatred of anything Korean, anything Asian. And so that made it really hard when I was 16 and I moved to Korea. My father worked in computers, and his company moved him to their branch in Seoul. And so I had to go with them and attended an international school where for the first time I was exposed to a lot of Koreans being in Korea. And so oddly enough, it actually strengthened my resolve to disconnect myself from anything Korean. So, to the point where I would force my mom to go to the local black market and buy cans of Chef Boyardee beefaroni, which I loved. That was my way of maintaining this American bubble and refusing to interact with the outside culture of Korea. I barely learned any Korean. In fact, I refused to learn Korean. It made it hard to get around and enjoy being in Korea. But the space of Utah, that I stepped into, California in the 1970s, right? It just made it really difficult for me, and I think a lot of second generation Asian Americans at that time, to embrace their cultural heritage. All right, so I'm going to show some snapshots, some data points about Asian America today. So I mentioned briefly the 1965 Immigration Act that brought immigrants like my parents to the US, and it led to a huge population explosion for Asian Americans. It also made it incredibly diverse, whereas previously Asian Americans were, for the most part, of Japanese descent or Chinese descent, with smaller populations of Koreans, Filipinx, and Asian Indians. It was predominantly working class, predominantly English speaking, and predominantly US born. That completely changed with the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. Now, at this point, the Asian American population is over 22 million. It's grown 81% between 2000 and 2019, making it the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the US. And indeed, by 2050, Asian Americans are projected to be the largest immigrant group in the US. And within Asian America, there is an incredible diversity of national origins, over 19 groups, mostly from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. The majority of Asian Americans are from 6 origin groups, as you can see there in that pie chart. Chinese are almost a quarter of all Asian Americans, followed by Indians, Filipinos or Filipinx, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. But it is interesting to note that among some of the smaller groups, they're gaining numbers in certain places. So for example, I mentioned that I live here in Columbus, Ohio, which is home to the largest Bhutanese Nepalese group in the US. And so there are these sort of interesting pockets of Asian Americans throughout the US that are outside of these 6 groups. Geographically, nearly half of all Asian Americans live in the West, especially in California. But again, this geographic landscape is shifting, right? So we see big communities of Chinese and Vietnamese Americans in Houston and New Orleans. The Vietnamese Americans are thriving in the shrimping industry in New Orleans, for example. Here in Columbus, Columbus has the largest Asian American community in Ohio, bigger than Cleveland, bigger than Cincinnati. I taught at the University of Maryland, which is of course in the DMV area, home to big Korean American, Indian American, Vietnamese American communities, and so on, right? So even where Asian Americans are being dispersed is changing. And then some more numbers that I think are interesting. So again, before 1965, most Asian Americans were US born, but now that's completely different. Asian Americans are now a majority immigrant group. Around 6 in 10 Asian Americans were born in another country. And then when we talk about undocumented immigrants, we rarely think or talk about Asian Americans, but in fact, people of Asian descent made up about 14% of the total undocumented immigrant population as of 2017. The Asian American population is substantially younger than the rest of the Asian American population. Or I'm sorry, US born Asians are younger than the rest of the Asian American population. And then something that distinguishes Asian Americans from other racial groups is that over a quarter live in multi-generational households. And some of you may have read articles, or maybe you know this yourself, that one of the reasons why so many Asian American parents decided to take their kids out of school, if they had that option, to do online learning, was because of the fear that they could bring COVID into their household with elderly grandparents being more susceptible, right? And so, yeah, that's I think something that really distinguishes Asian Americans from other people of color. And like I mentioned, and I'm sure everyone here knows, ever since COVID hit the US in March, anti-Asian violence has dramatically increased. And according to Stop AAPI Hate, as of December 2021, there have been almost 11,000 incidences against Asian American and Pacific Islander persons. And a majority, I think almost 2/3 of these incidences have targeted women and non-binary folks. And in 2021, there was actually an increase of anti-Asian violence versus the first year of the pandemic in 2020. And, of course, this has only exacerbated this sense that Asian Americans don't belong in our own country. But, interpersonal attacks or violence on the street is not the only form of violence that Asian Americans face. In the workplace, for example, Asian Americans feel like they don't belong. According to this statistic, 40% feel like they don't have a sense of belonging to their company, even though over 90% say that they really care about their company's success. And this speaks to a phenomenon that is called the bamboo ceiling, which is how Asian Americans in the corporate spaces face barriers to advancement, promotion, because they're not seen as leadership material, which is tied to the model minority myth, something I'll mention a little bit later in this presentation. But this is just a very small snapshot of how, again, Asian Americans don't feel like they belong. And of course, this increasing violence just makes that even more acute. And the sense of not belonging, I think, can be captured in these two questions. And it's always two, not just the first one, which is, where are you from? Where are you really from? And I'm curious, just by a show of virtual hands or comments in the chat box, how many of you have faced some version of these two questions? And let's see, where did the chat box go for me? Oh, I see it. Okay, yep, I see a hand. Anyone else has faced? Oh. Isabel has, okay, so several people. Would anyone like to chime in and share an incident in which you faced this line of questioning? Maybe it happened recently even. Maybe Elena Cho. I don't know if this is the Elena Cho I know. I have a friend named Elena Cho. Or
Harry. Yes, it is your friend Elena Cho. Hi.
Hey, I wasn't sure because, you know, a lot of Elena Cho's, but okay. Hey, Elena.
Hi. Yeah, I was one of the ones to raise my hand growing up, as an Asian American in New Orleans. I also share that same feeling of just alienation. And I would get that question all the time. And just like you, just never really felt a sense of belonging. So that's what I wanted to share. Thanks, Terry.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Thanks for being here, Elena. And I see Milagros in the chat box says, I was an international student in California and was asked this question. I look Chinese, sound Midwestern, interesting, but from the Philippines. Did you want to share a little bit more?
Sure. Well, this was pretty much the case throughout all my undergraduate years. Mind you, this was a few decades ago, but this case of never being easily determined based on how I look and on how I sound has caused a lot of possibly some cognitive dissonance in a lot of the places that I've lived. So when I was in China, a lot of people expected me to speak Chinese, and my Chinese is fairly, decent. But that would always cause a little bit of friction because they would expect me to know the language. And then when I'm here in the Philippines, because of tension between China and the Philippines, some people will automatically ask me, why are you here? Or they will identify me as part of that, the group that is here to dislodge people from their jobs or, and all that. So I've never actually found anywhere where I could actually say, I don't have to worry about people asking me about my identity. But I've come to a certain sense of understanding about that. So I'm no longer at the state in my life where I have to defend myself. And so it depends on the situation. I will just automatically either make it a game or go through a very quick explanation when I just don't have time. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. And I mean, that just shows how complicated it is, right? That questioning isn't something that just happens in the US, but It can happen in other countries, in Asia and China or the Philippines, and it can bear interethnic tensions, right? That maybe some folks aren't aware of, right? Of historical tensions between China and the Philippines, but that can be embedded in that line of questioning too, and make it even harder to answer. And I'm sure harder to have a sense of where one belongs, right? Where one can never have to answer that question. Yeah, the geopolitical undertones are so much fun. I can sense the sarcasm in that comment. Here's an example of how one could respond to this line of questioning, just to bring a little bit of levity. Not that photo there, but in this video that maybe some of you have heard, or maybe not, and it's a short one.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean, before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, well, where are your people from?
Well, my great grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean, but I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Shasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Hello, Gumdrop! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's go sporty. Double, double, toil and trouble. Mind the gap, beware Jack the Ripper. Bloody hell! Pip, pip, cheerio! I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
All right. You can see a couple of folks have seen that video. Definitely a classic. It's funny because I was also born in Orange County and also never lived there. And I also love fish and chips. So I really relate to this video in many different ways. Yeah. Oh. And then another instance, not as funny instance of this, the logic behind that question of where are you from is with this person. I don't know if there are any figure skater fans. This is a little bit further back in the day in the 1990s, but this is Michelle Kwan, who you can see holding a team gold medal, but in the 98 Nagano Winter Olympics, she was predicted to win the individual gold, but lost to her teammate. I forget who. I want to say Tara Lipinski, but I could be wrong. But this was the headline that came out by MSNBC that caused a huge uproar, which was American beats out Kwan. Yeah. And pretty insulting stuff, right? Because of course, Michelle Kwan is American. And yet, even on the highest stage of athletic competition, representing Team USA, her home country, she is still not seen as fully American. She is seen as a forever foreigner, which is one of the dominant frameworks, right, that shapes our understanding of Asian Americans as not being fully American, no matter if they were born in the US or lived there most of their life in the US, if their grandparents were born in the US, built the transcontinental railroad, it doesn't matter, right? That they're always seen as perpetually outside of the US nation state, perpetually outside of full belonging and all of the political legal, social rights that is afforded to those who are seen as belonging to the US. And even more recently, we saw an even more insidious example of this forever foreigner ideology when Suni Lee, who I'm sure some of you know is the first Hmong American to win a gold medal for Team USA, was pepper sprayed in Los Angeles, with a city with a huge Asian American population. But she was attacked as she was waiting for a rideshare taxi with her friends. And yeah, just another instance of someone who, again, competed for Team USA and yet is still not seen as fully American. And this gets to this idea of yellow peril, which is defined by a couple of Asian American scholars as that which casts Asian and Asian Americans as economic, political, and sexual threats to the West, or wanting to take it over, as you can see in that anti-Chinese political cartoon from the early 1880s. This idea, again, that Asian or Asian Americans are not fully American and in fact are threats to dismantle, to invade the US. And this pops up anytime there's a socioeconomic crisis, like in the 1870s and early 1880s, when the US was rapidly industrializing, factories were popping up everywhere, robber barons were making a lot of money off of workers, there was a depression, and so the blame was aimed at Chinese migrant laborers. And you could see the ways that they were othered. They were made into monsters or animals, literally, as rats invading the proper home of a good working class American. And these are not innocent cultural representations, but in fact mobilize support for policies to exclude Chinese immigrants from the US. And that's actually an advertisement for a washing machine, but it pulled from and exacerbated this idea that Asian Americans are yellow peril threats to the nation. And it was really the anti-Chinese movement that provided this template of yellow peril from the 1860s to 1880s. And that led to the passage of the first federal legislation aimed at a racial or ethnic group, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented Chinese workers from entering the US and restricted Chinese already in the US from attaining citizenship. And this was the playbook, right, that the US used for subsequent Asian immigrant groups, like the Japanese, who started to immigrate in the 1890s to the 1920s. They faced the same kind of racial hostility from labor unions, such as the one that organized this is the anti-Japanese exclusion, or the Japanese Korean Exclusion League, to vigilante violence or everyday violence. And in fact, this photo, when I first saw it, I assumed it was from the wartime period when 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated. This is from 1920, right? And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that things like Executive Order 8802 or 9066 don't just happen in a vacuum, right? There are decades of simmering anti-Japanese hostility that make it possible, for example, the Supreme Court to prevent Japanese Americans from attaining citizenship, as in the Supreme Court case of Ozawa versus US. And then when Asian Indians started to immigrate to the US from Canada, they faced the same kind of hostility. Instead of yellow peril, it's called dusky or brown peril, but the same logic, right? That shaped understandings of Asian Indians as invasive threats to the economic, social, and political health of California and the US in general. And just like with Ozawa versus US, there was another Supreme Court case the following year that determined that Asian Indians could not be considered white and therefore were not eligible for naturalization rights. And this all stemmed from the 1790 Naturalization Act that equated the right to naturalize with being a free white person, right? So white supremacy is literally written into the law and is what prevented Asian immigrants from attaining that sense of belonging. And then we have the anti-Filipinx movement of the 1920s and 30s. Of course, the Philippines was colonized by the US after the Spanish-American War. And there was an American-Filipino War that ensued. The US attained full control. And as Philippine-X immigrants started to arrive in the US as agricultural laborers, again, they faced hostility, especially throughout California. So by 1924, when another immigration act was passed, Asians were barred from entering the US. Asian immigrants already in the US could not become US citizens and therefore could not own land, couldn't vote, hold political office, even marry white women as a result of the Cable Act, or buy homes in white neighborhoods. They were also subjected to racial covenants, just like Blacks were in the US. And even second generation Asian Americans during the early 20th century did not feel fully American, even though they had citizenship as a result of being born in the US. In terms of employment, even if they had a college degree, a law degree, they could not attain jobs that matched their skill level. They had to run their parents' grocery store or farm. And so the main takeaway here is that the US legally, socially, and politically unwelcomed Asian Americans, right? This idea that Asian Americans are foreign, that just seems like common sense. Asian Americans were made to be foreign as a result of these legal actions, social, political exclusions, right? So this question of where are you really from, I say, is a reminder of this racist history and its violent continuation in the present moment of anti-Asian violence. And of course, culture and media sustain and reproduce these ideas, right? Especially along gendered lines. So for Asian American women, they have fallen trapped into one of two stereotypes: the innocent, submissive lotus blossom, or the aggressive, hypersexualized dragon lady. And then for Asian American men, there have also been these straight-jacketed forms of masculinity. And especially, I'm looking at the bottom left corner, Long Duck Dong. For someone growing up in the 1980s, he made it really hard to be fully seen, and for Asian American men to fully accept ourselves, no matter if our masculinity aligned with a dominant form of or a toxic form of masculinity, right? We had no control over our own representation, and only exacerbates that sense of not fully belonging to the US. And so whether in pop culture, political cartoons, advertisements, all the way up to the current moment of President Trump using Kung Flu, and even that poster on the right, which interestingly came out before COVID-19, but still writing this hysteria of the anti-vaccine movement, equating forced vaccinations with East Asian doctors. That yellow peril is infused throughout US culture, society, politics, etc. And so that's how we're at this moment, right, of intense and continued anti-Asian violence. Of course, last year's shooting in Atlanta, the most visible reminder, but then even more recently, Christina Yuna Lee, Korean American woman in New York City who was murdered. And then I even just saw today, I think another Philippine-X elder was attacked in New York City. Several Philippine-X folks have been attacked. Oops. I'm also aware of the time. I want to leave time for a Q&A. So I have more to present, but actually I would rather stop. And well, let me show this poem, because I think actually this is a good place to stop. Let me show this poem and then we can have more of a discussion. Let me see. Okay.
Eight responses to the phrase, go back to where you came from. 1, oh, you mean Minnesota? In which case, here I am. 2, oh, you mean where I'm really from? In which case, here I am. 3, if this is a reference to my people, then you're gonna have to be a little bit more specific. How about try and go back to St. Paul, or go back to Fresno, go back to Bundy 9, go back to Longgang, go back to San Quang upon taking my advice. Also realize that you're not the first to give the command return to point us in the opposite direction with the barrel of a pistol. Call me Hmong before you call me American, because Hmong is the closest word I know to home for. Do you ever wonder where you come from? Do you find comfort in vague memories of Ellis Island? How many servings from the melting pot did it take for you to arrive at this conversation? Maybe you take pride in the Mayflower. Maybe you are an original American. Do you ever ask yourself if maybe the land we stand on today once belonged to someone else? Do you ever ask yourself if maybe the land had never belonged to any of us, and if instead we belong to the land? 5, when I was younger, I took the journey back to Thailand, hoping to find our villages still dotting the sides of mountains, hoping to hear Kutsia still echoing throughout the valleys. Upon entering the house of an elder, he apologizes to me. Embarrassed that his youngest son could not introduce himself to me in our language, tells me that if you're all grown up to be anything more than a farmer or a servant in this country, you must learn to leave your language behind. I want to tell this man that throughout my time here, I've never felt so close to where I come from. 6, my mother tells me that before I ever took in my first breath, I was an invisible spirit floating around in the clouds, waiting for a stomach that could paint me pink. My mother tells me that death is a slow journey back, that if not done carefully, we will wander the earth, cursing those still living, but under the watchful eyes of our loved ones, we will always know our way home. 7, for the longest time, I believe that the hummingbird did not possess a pair of feet, instead always existing in a state of mid-flight. How sad I thought, to always be at the mercy of the wind, to be so close to the earth, yet own none of it. My time here has taught me how lucky the hummingbird to belong to the sky. 8, I'm going.
I don't know if people were able to see it, or maybe you just heard it. Okay. It's, for me, it's such a beautiful, moving piece that resists the logics behind that question of where are you from, and redefines what it means. And I love that image of the hummingbird who's suspended in midair, not on land, but soaring to the sky. Is yeah, just a sort of transcendent way to think about where home is, as in constant moving, of going. All right, I want to show a few more slides, and then we'll have a discussion. Some concrete suggestions for staff members to make their Asian American grantees feel more safe and more welcome. All right, okay. All right, now hopefully you should be able to see the slide. So first, attend presentations like this. Good job, you've already done it. But don't stop learning about Asian American histories or experiences or culture. There are so many resources out there now that are widely available, whether in books or online, or films, right, are a kind of resource. And specifically, I recommend Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, which came out a couple of years ago. I assigned it in a couple of my introductory Asian American Studies classes. Students loved it. It's a great overview of both historical and contemporary experiences in the form of a memoir. And then something I'm reading just now is called Tastes Like War, which is by one of my favorite Korean American scholars, a mixed race Korean American woman, who writes about her mom's schizophrenia and the relationship with food, by Grace Cho. Second, recognize and refute assumptions that are rooted in either a forever foreigner framework, where are you really from, or the model minority myth, which I know I didn't get to cover, but maybe I'll cover in a later presentation. But this idea that Asian Americans are crazy rich and highly successful and educated and don't need any help or assistance, but actually could use a lot of help. And then third, and I love this, this is she's one of my favorite comedians. I encourage you to follow her, Young Me Mayer. This is one of her many tweets or Instagram posts. One of the most jarring experiences is when something bad happens to Asians and I go to an all white space and someone asks me how I feel and I say sad and they say, oh no, why? Right. So recognize that the resurgence of anti-Asian violence in terms of these interpersonal attacks, it's having an effect on a lot of us, right? A lot of us are struggling, even if we didn't endure it ourselves. Maybe we witnessed an attack. Maybe we're scared for our grandparents or our neighbors. It is having a huge impact on the mental health of a lot of Asian American participants. And just understanding that can mean a lot to your participants. Next, for those who may seem hesitant to provide an explanation of their Asian roots to people they meet, understand that doing so may be triggering because, again, for a lot of us, we're often forced to explain our roots in the form of where are you from, right? And that exploration of our roots is constrained by that forever foreigner framework that deprives us of our Americanness, right? So, basically practice patience for Asian Americans who had to face that line of questioning every day, who were not seen as fully American. And then for those Asian Americans doing research in their heritage country, if that heritage country was impacted by a US involved war, which is a lot of Asian countries, it can be really difficult to navigate the legacies of that war, of the Korean War, of the Vietnam War, the Cambodian genocide, because of the way it's not talked about in our families, the ways that war and militarization are kept as a secret, a shameful secret, right? For me, for example, I could never get more than 3 sentences about the Korean War from my parents. They didn't want to talk about it. And it's understandable why. It was one of the most horrific, traumatizing wars. So then to go to that country and to learn more about your family's history from strangers is incredibly difficult and incredibly complicated. So again, practicing patience and empathy is important there. And then finally, not all Asian Americans are ashamed. Some of us are proud. Some of us are on a journey of learning to be proud. Some are just beginning to recognize that our shame comes from somewhere, that it's not natural. Others have had experiences where they do feel like they don't fully belong here nor there. At the same time, others have created their own sense of home that don't align with any national identity, whether the US or Indonesia or Korea, etc. They find home in K-pop fan websites or where do I find home? I don't know, when I cook Korean food for my friends and family. We do create spaces of home that are really meaningful, but maybe aren't so easy to explain in one sentence. So recognizing and giving space to all of these complexities, journeys, questions, and creations can go a long way to making your Asian American grantees feel safe and feel like they do belong. Oh, that's another spoken word piece, but I can drop it in the chat box. Okay, what time is it? Oh, there's some time for Q&A. I'm sorry I went over, but yeah, I'm happy to answer other questions, and I'll stop the share here.
Terry, thank you so much for sharing this really important context for what our Asian American participants are experiencing and feeling, and their perspectives and the history that is behind all of what's going on in the United States right now, and the places that some of our participants are coming from. And thanks for sharing your personal story, because I think that really brings home these kinds of experiences. And I know sometimes it's not the easiest thing to be talking about how this affected you personally, but I know that many of us who work in the East Asian and Pacific region, have seen our participants go through some of these emotions of trying to deal with the complexities of their identities. And many of the staff who are working at our posts and commissions also go through this themselves. So I really appreciate your willingness to share. I'm going to give it over to the audience. So we've got about 10-15 minutes left for questions. So if anyone would like to unmute themselves, or if you'd like to type something in the chat, if you have a question for Dr. Park, please go ahead. And I'm going to switch us over into the gallery view and unpin us so we can see everybody.
I know it was a lot that I threw out at folks, both personally and politically. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have, including stuff on the model minority myth, which again, I didn't have time to get into, but I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Hi, it's Jane. So there is something that I've thought about as a Korean American woman. As during the pandemic, a lot of incidents were targeting Asian American women. I wonder if, part of what makes it particularly complicated for us is that, I think your statistics showed that, the numbers of Asian Americans who are not born here and who are actually from other places, whether it's pretty recent or a little bit farther back, but not born here. The fact that there is such a range and maybe a majority of people who are relatively recent arrivals, and that there isn't an easy, obvious way for outsiders to distinguish, right, between Asian Americans who really did grow up their whole lives here and the ones who may be from somewhere else. I think that's, in my mind, that's always been a complicating factor, because I think that some of the Asian American community that was born here also kind of doesn't want to always identify with the freshly arrived immigrants, right? Like there is this sense of, like, I remember when I was a kid, it was like, no, I was born here, as if, well, what if I hadn't been? Like, what would have been so bad about that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I think, it's thinking about that question of where are you from has kind of forced me to both extend, some patience for the person who's asking the question, especially if they themselves are an immigrant, which has happened a lot, actually, especially in big cities that are diverse. And I can't think of how many times I've been in a taxi where someone from another country has asked me, where are you from? And I've had to pause, right? Because there's a certain reactivity from having been asked that question my entire life in Utah and knowing, that meant something else versus a Moroccan immigrant who's just trying to find a connection, and seeing a face that to him or her or them reads as immigrant, and maybe there's something in common.
Right.
And then when we see the statistics, right, that actually a majority of Asian Americans are immigrants, are not born here, then why wouldn't someone assume that someone who is Asian presenting is not from here.
Right.
So yeah, I don't have, yeah, I really appreciate what you've brought up, because it just, again, it just shows the complexity of Asian American identities and experiences, right?
Yeah, and I feel like some of it might also be, might involve some class issues,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
Because if there's a fair number of recent immigrants who, you know, are not documented and who don't have certain economic opportunities, you know, is there a contingent of American-born Asian Americans who really don't want to be confused for that, you know, economically disadvantaged person after working their whole lives to, like, let's say, be in the top 1%? That class issue might also be at play in terms of the solidarity within the Asian American community.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much internalized hatred that cuts across racial, ethnic, class lines, gender, sexuality. Absolutely. And I know for me, when I didn't want to have anything to do with other Asian people, I think some of it was rooted in my own class privilege. I'm also thinking, you know, of certain right-wing anti-affirmative action voices in more recent Chinese and Asian Indian communities, where for me, I'm like, oh, that's another, you know, so-called fresh off the boat community that I don't know if I want to be associated with them, but it's not because of class lines. It's because of politics, a very different kind of politics. And so how we negotiate these divisions and internalizations, I don't have any easy answers. I just think having a more historical awareness of the complexities of my immigration, of settlement, of labor, right, can I think add some nuance and empathy in these conversations.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I see a question in the chat box. Do you have students coming back from a Fulbright experience in their heritage country that struggle with readjusting to the American context? Is this a question directed at me or to other staff? I don't have Fulbright students.
I mean, maybe you could just speak to, have you had any experiences with, you know, Asian American friends or students that you've had who have gone on these trips to visit their country of heritage or culture, and then have a difficult time when they're coming back, maybe because of what they encountered there, some of the things you were discussing earlier about, you know, wartime or family issues?
I'm having a hard time thinking of any students in that situation. I can think of just myself and what it was like for me to spend time in Korea. I didn't study abroad or do a program like the Fulbright in Korea, but after college, I spent 2 years in Seoul as a media activist, and I took Korean classes. I basically did a 180, where before college I hated being in Korea, and then, you know, like a lot of people in college, you take classes and critical race theory happens. Oh no. And then I went back to Korea with a very different perspective and attitude, where I wanted to just dive into South Korean social movements. And coming back to the US, for me, it was kind of difficult, partly because by the end of my 2 years in South Korea, I felt like I still didn't belong there, that I was constantly told that I'm not Korean. My own family members would say that. And so I kind of felt deflated that, okay, I don't belong here in the US clearly, and it sounds like I don't belong in Korea either. And so I think for me, it actually impelled me to dive deeper into an Asian American context, right, where I could connect with other Asian American folks who had the same experiences of feeling liminal, right, of not being here nor there, but also like understanding why I wasn't seen as Korean, considering, again, the colonial history of Korea, how the Korean language was banned by the Japanese colonial officials, right? So again, for me, history can create a lot of empathy for why one may not feel like they belong here nor there, but also creating communities that can transcend these really strict national binaries and strict definitions of what it means to be Korean or what it means to be American.
I have one final question since we're about at time, and this was something that was sent in previously. I think that what a lot of our staff at Commissions and Posts are facing is how to talk about anti-Asian violence, both to our American grantees that are coming into the region, and then also for our grantees from Asia who are going to the United States. And I was just wondering if you have any feedback or any suggestions on how to broach that topic. You know, oftentimes I think it's a very positive time, right? When people are departing for their grants, we want to be encouraging. But I also think, on the other hand, it's important for people to be aware of what's going on and for this conversation to happen. So I would really appreciate your feedback on that.
Yeah, that is tough for both groups of course, Asian Americans going to Asia, whether to their heritage country or not. Knowing that they have family members, especially elderly folks who may be more susceptible to these kind of street level attacks, but also the need to expand the meaning of violence and hate beyond just these interpersonal attacks, right? To think of violence in more institutional terms of the health inequities that a lot of Asian Americans face. The fact that in New York City, Chinese Americans experience the highest rates of poverty than any other ethnic group. That housing insecurity is a huge issue for Asian Americans that live in urban areas. That these are forms of violence, anti-Asian violence, that don't receive as much attention in the media, that don't get the clicks in social media, but that, you know, some of these Asian American grantees may be carrying with them, right? They may be the main form of economic support for their parents, and then, you know, they go off to study for a year. That can cause a lot of anxiety. So that's what I would say for that group. For Asians coming to the U.S. now, I don't know. I feel I'm starting to feel a little emotional. I don't know. I feel just sad, really sad that, you know, they're coming to this country, you know, maybe for the first time wanting to do a project, and they have to worry about their safety. First of all, I would honor and respect that concern. That is a real concern. You know, even in places that have huge Asian American populations. And in fact, it seems like a lot of these interpersonal attacks are happening in places like LA and New York City and the Bay Area. And also, like, recognizing their own forms of support and care. Like, for example, I gave a talk a few months ago at this biomedical research laboratory, the Jackson Laboratory in Maine. And one of the issues they talked about was how all of the Chinese scientists are they just hang out together, and they don't seem like they want to talk to other non-Chinese or white scientists, and that's an issue, right? Because we want to create a more diverse and inclusive and equitable arena. But at the same time, they may feel really unsafe being in this country right now. So it might make sense for them, right, to seek safety and recognition and refuge among people who look like them and speak the same language. So I would sort of caution or encourage people to maintain that recognition of these various forms of support and safety and community, because this is an awful time to be Asian, whether you identify as Asian American or not. The fact is, a lot of Asian Americans are seen as as targets, and just, again, yeah, honoring that, I think, can go a long way.
Hi, Terry. If you don't mind, can I have 1 minute? I'm Serena. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah. Is there enough time, or I don't know?
Just-
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I just want to thank you so much for this incredible session. I'm from IE Beijing, and I work with Fulbrighters for a number of years here. Actually, some of our Fulbrighters to China also had many discussions about identity issues. And I remember an Asian American student who shared her story with me and said, although she was born in the US, she still felt the sense of exclusion from time to time when in the US. And she said her identity as a second generation of immigrant didn't really give her a sense of belonging, and it was really frustrating. And now I think I can understand better her story with this cultural and historical background. And I really hope that we can do more to change the experience of people like her, and also to give them the support that they need. And interestingly, I also want to add that I remember that some of our Asian American students said they also had this culture shock when they work and live in China. When people here are expecting them to speak the Chinese language like the locals because they look like Chinese. And people get really surprised when they found that the Fulbrighters involved can't really speak the language the same way as they do. So this is really something that the other Fulbrighters who don't look like Chinese would experience. Anyway, so thank you so much for sharing and for this mind-blowing session.
Oh, thank you for that kind comment. And just briefly, what you just said, I think, points to how Asian Americans in Asia can actually provide a more expansive understanding of what it means to be Chinese or Korean, right? Like Koreanness, Indonesianness, Vietnameseness gets invented and reinvented all the time throughout the diaspora in ways that may challenge like narrow national understandings of what it means to be Lao or Vietnamese, et cetera, right? So I think it's actually a great opportunity for these Asian Americans with their awful way of speaking Korean, like me with my weird Utah accent. I don't know if I have a Utah accent, but that I'm sure when I go to Korea and I'm acting the way that I act, it blows their minds. Oh, that's a way to be Korean, right? And then one can have conversations, right? That identities are not fixed; they're always in flux. And I think the more interaction, the more engagement across borders, the more expansive our understanding can be of what it means to be Korean or what it means to be Japanese, and thus that sense of refuge, of belonging, can also expand across the world. So yeah, thank you so much for your comment.
Well, Terry, Dr. Park, I want to thank you so much for your time tonight and for this really incredible presentation and conversation. I wish we had another 2 hours to keep going on this, as I'm sure that we could have a lot more to say about it, but perhaps you can come back for another seminar. And for those of you who were not here in the beginning, if you are interested in reaching out to Dr. Park through his consulting work with Maum Consulting, he has put the link for his LinkedIn up in the chat box, and maybe he can throw it back in there again.
After saving with customized car insurance.
So thanks everyone for attending the EAP occasional seminar tonight. And I hope that we will see you all again at the upcoming seminars. I'll be making announcements for this on the list of people who have been signed up for these seminars, as well as in the EAP diverse newsletter. So thanks everyone, and have a good day or a good evening, depending on what side of the world you're coming from. And we hope to see you at the next seminar.
Thank you, Kelly, once again. Thanks, everyone. And I dropped my LinkedIn link, as well as that other spoken word poem that I didn't get to show, but it's a great poem by a young Chinese American woman who talks about pretty much what we talked about today.